My guest is Robert Spencer. He's one of the nation's preeminent experts on jihad and radical Islam. He is the author of the new book, The History of Jihad, From Muhammad to ISIS. He's the director of Jihad Watch. Robert, thanks for joining me today.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Robert, firstly, I want to ask you about the obvious here in Boston, and that is that in the course of my travels, I am seeing increasing numbers of Muslim people. They make that well known by their dress and by their headgear and whatnot. And they seem like peaceful people to me. I don't know them, obviously. Who knows what's really going on? And I don't like to think ill of them. What is this all about for the United States? What does this portend? Because I'm reading in Europe about the rape gangs and no-go zones and jihad violence across the continent. Should we be concerned about that here? And should we consider the possibility that American Muslims might be able to assimilate like any other ethnic group?
Well, Chuck, the thing is that individuals are individuals. People are people everywhere. Human nature is everywhere the same. And so there are individual Muslims who are wonderful people who are never going to wage jihad. Unfortunately, with the massive Muslim migrant influx into Western Europe, we have seen that some of the Muslims are going to wage jihad. And given the fact that there's been no reformation, as I show in the book, there's been no change in the jihad doctrines that have fueled warfare against unbelievers for 1400 years, we should not be surprised that some Muslims in Europe are waging jihad against unbelievers. And we shouldn't be surprised if it comes to the US as well. This doesn't mean that we should treat any innocent person in any unkind manner, but we have to be aware that this is happening and call upon the mosques in the United States and Muslim organizations in the United States to renounce the aspects of Islam and Islamic law that are at variance with constitutional freedoms.
And yet there are mainstream so-called Muslim organizations in the United States like CARE and ISNA and others who have not done this. We have certainly moderate Muslims like Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who I've interviewed and who totally recognizes jihad as wrong and some of the other practices as well in Sharia, and who wants to kind of, I'm sorry to use a term, but westernize, if not actually Christianize Islam, so it could become like any other religion in the United States. But he seems to be up against an establishment in the Muslim community that opposes that, and that they seem to be backed by the left. What do you make of that?
Chuck, it has to be noted that every major Muslim organization in the country, without any exception, has ties to Hamas, the jihad terror group in Gaza, and the Muslim Brotherhood, which is dedicated to establishing Islamic law around the world. This is something that's universal. Now, Zuhdi Jasser has the American Islamic Forum for Democracy has only a handful of Muslim members, more non-Muslims than Muslims, because non-Muslims are hoping for some sign of hope, some sign of reform. But really, this group has no traction among American Muslims, and we have to be realistic about that. When it comes to these Muslim organizations in the United States, they have resisted every counter-terror measure that's ever been proposed or implemented anywhere. They've gotten successful counter-terror programs, notably one in New York City, shut down for being so-called Islamophobic. So this is something also that we need to realize. One of the reasons why it's so important to classify the Muslim Brotherhood as a terror organization, which is something that's in the works now, is because it would lead to the possibility of prosecuting these American Muslim groups, which have been getting away with quite a bit for many years, posing as neutral civil rights organizations when they're anything but.
And they're very slick at it, I may point out. I mean, and they work both sides of the aisle. You see them working Democrat and Republican. When I ran for office in Massachusetts 10 years ago as a Republican, I was in Washington, and there was a representative from a Muslim group kind of working the room, and he was very slick, doing very well. He didn't come anywhere near me because he could see that I knew what was going on. But they're working their way into positions of influence, and it's again, this is not an issue of of average Muslims who I think would like to assimilate. I mean, my theory is that they're afraid of going against this establishment in the same way that people might have been afraid to oppose the mafia back in the 1920s. This is a terror group that uses very strong, bully boy tactics to attack actually Muslims as much as anyone else who don't toe the line of their agenda. So, but you seem to say that there's generally a sentiment among the Muslim community in the United States to support not necessarily outright violent jihad or the literal implementation of Sharia, but maybe a softer version, what they call civilizational jihad.
They may not support it, but they're not going to do anything against it. This is the thing we've seen again and again over the years. For example, when ISIS was in its heyday, there were several demonstrations in the United States and in Canada, elsewhere, that were called Muslims Against ISIS. And that was great to see, except for the fact that only 25 Muslims here, 50 Muslims there showed up. Whereas when you had demonstrations against drawing cartoons of Muhammad, you had 800,000 Muslims in Chechnya, hundreds of thousands in Pakistan and Iran. And so if we're going to try to count upon these moderate Muslims to save the day for us, we have to face the fact that they don't have any traditional form of Islam that doesn't teach violence against unbelievers, and they don't have any significant support within the Muslim community. The left, getting back to your first question, I forgot to answer this part of it. The left in allying with these Muslim Brotherhood organizations, I think, is betraying the fact that it hates America, hates Christianity, hates Judeo-Christian civilization more than it's worried about jihad terror. And so it's playing the enemy of my enemy is my friend game.
I think that they also, and maybe it's a subconscious way, they resonate with certain elements in Islam. The idea of jihad could be seen as the leftist idea of, quote, revolution, a world conquest, a subjugation of the entire planet under the scimitar, or in their view, under the Soviet. This idea of Sharia law, which is really a hyper nanny state, the idea that the government basically controls all aspects or as many aspects of the person's life as possible and uses state power to do it, and that's moral and justified. So I think that philosophically, in many ways, they resonate with radical Islam, and I think they have common enemies, those enemies being the United States, Israel, the Western democracies, because these are countries that, first of all, assert their sovereign rights to nationhood. Secondly, because in the case of Israel anyway, and some European countries, they are openly religious in that Israel's a Jewish state, the European countries are Christian states. And that is something the left despises, but they find common cause with Muslims, therefore, because they hope that Muslims will come in and subvert and undermine these societies.
Yeah, absolutely. They both have a totalitarian impulse, that they both think of they envision a utopia of the paradise on earth, the dictatorship of the proletariat for the hard left, and Sharia state for Islam. Both of them enforce an earthly paradise by a reign of terror. That is, they'll kill you if you get out of line. And so I think that they do see each other as kindred in that way.
Now, I think the thing that has got you in trouble, Robert, is that your scholarly works do something very shocking. You quote from the Prophet Muhammad. You quote from the Quran. You quote from the Hadith. And you simply do so in a way that is unvarnished. Here's the quote. Here's the context. And that's something that I think there's a huge effort to sort of reduce and sublimate in the mind of the public. But it's there for anyone who reads it. I mean, the life of Muhammad is one of violence and conquest and military occupation and subjugation of those who didn't agree with him in the most violent way. This was his mission. This was what he was all about. And it definitely contrasts with the life of Jesus. It's, where people would voluntarily accept Jesus as the Messiah through their own volition and as their intercessor with God. There was no, I mean, certainly when Christianity has conquered countries and forced people, which is something that's happened in history, those are exceptions. Those are not part of the faith. I mean, that certainly does happen, and people have done things in the name of Christianity, but it's not, there's nothing in Christianity like jihad. There's nothing in Christianity like Sharia. You know, it's more of a personal religion. I mean, Christianity took over the Roman Empire through proselytizing and through peaceful means of mainly teaching the faith through women mostly, until one day, Constantine woke up one day and said, "Oh my goodness, the country's Christian." And he threw in the towel and he stopped the war against Christianity. And I think that's what's happening, by the way, in China today. But with Islam, it's physical conquest of the land. It is, a complete subjugation of the people and a submission. In fact, the word Islam means to submit. Would you say that that's an accurate contrast there?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. People talk about these religions as if they were 100% equivalent. And I frequently hear people saying, oh, well, Islam is 600 years younger than Christianity, so in 600 years, everything will be peaceful. Well, I don't have that long to wait. That's one problem with that. But the other is that assumes that all religions are essentially the same, when actually Christianity does not have, in any of its forms, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, there's no Christianity that teaches warfare against unbelievers, whereas all the different sects of Islam teach that Muslims must wage war in order to establish the hegemony of Islam over the world. So there's really no comparison. These things are doctrines of Islam, whereas violence against unbelievers is not doctrinal in Christianity. The Christians have done it, but they were acting at variance with and against the teachings of Christianity rather than in accord with them.
Now, there's a kind of a modern interpretation of jihad, which says that it's, a kind of a personal war against oneself as one tries to purify one's own soul and become a better person, and then try to teach in society, which I think is kind of almost a Christianization of the concept of jihad. But also, in fairness, we should note that there have been Muslim nations and Muslim civilizations throughout history who have adhered to a more peaceful version of jihad. And so it is possible that jihad could be retranslated and reformatted in a sense to remove the violent and openly and overt bloody part of it. Is that true?
Chuck, I'm afraid I don't think so. In the book, The History of Jihad, that I've just written, here it is. I show from primary sources that 1400 years there has been more or less constant warfare between Muslims and non-Muslims, that everywhere Muslims have gone where there are non-Muslims, there's war. And it is based on the teachings of Muhammad, based on the teachings of the Quran, that have never been reformed, rejected, reconsidered anywhere. So you have more or less constant warfare. There was never a period, never an Islamic regime that did not carry out the oppression, the systematic oppression of non-Muslims and warfare against them. So you have this more or less constant warfare backed up by Islamic doctrine. There's not really any period. This book shows this. A lot of these things are historical myths. There's not a period of tolerance, multiculturalism, everybody getting along. These things never really happened. We like to believe they happen. There are actually concerted efforts nowadays to make people think that they happen on the part of people with a political agenda for today, like the people who want to soften the resistance to the mass Muslim migrant influx into Europe and to a lesser degree into North America. They have been putting out all these articles and books. I've written quite a bit about them lately, saying that Islamic rule in Europe was wonderful and tolerant and benign, so that people will think, oh, well, then it's not a big deal that all these people are coming in now, when actually that was not true historically, and it will not be true today.
I heard Dean Obeidallah on Progressive Radio, who calls himself a Muslim Palestinian activist, make reference to African slaves taken to the United States that were Muslims. He says that Muslims, therefore, have had a great contribution to the United States. He points out that in the book Roots, Kunta Kinte, the descendant of Alex Haley, was Muslim. Now, I don't know exactly how he related to his Islam, but the fact is that they were Muslim to the degree they were, mostly because they were enslaved by Muslim traders, and because the Arabs of Africa viewed black people as kaffa, as as a lesser class, and that they were they were extremely brutal toward black people in Africa. It's not like black people were happily embracing Islam. I think that there was almost probably a Holocaust in Africa conducted by the white, or basically Semitic but white Arab traders coming out of Saudi Arabia, and that this even has continued to this day in the South Sudan. Even though they're independent now, there was many decades where they were being brutally oppressed by the Arab government in Khartoum, and where you had 500,000 people killed. Would you say that's an accurate depiction of the history there?
Well, Dean Obeidallah is not telling the truth. He's wildly exaggerating. And most of the slaves who were brought from Africa were not Muslims. There were only a handful who were known to be Muslim. And we know this from the fact that the Muslim slavers generally did not enslave non-Muslims, and it was Muslim slavers who sold the slaves to the European slave traders who brought them to America. And so if there were any Muslims among them, it was by accident or because they were from warring tribes that had lost and so on. It was a small minority. There is no significant presence of Islam that is recorded among the American slaves. As a matter of fact, I've just been spending a good deal of time reading the slave narratives that were recorded in the 1930s from some of the surviving slaves who were in their 80s and 90s in those days, and they talked about their experiences as slaves in the United States. And there's just no hint of Islam anywhere. These people were not Muslims. They never knew of Islam. The people around them were not Muslims. It doesn't exist there. Here again, we have a rewriting of the historical narrative, but it also has been obscured nowadays. And this is something else that I deal with in the book, that abolitionism, the idea that slavery was immoral, only arose in a Christian context, out of the Christian idea that all men are equal in dignity, all human beings are equal in dignity before God. There's no such idea in Islam. In Islam, the Quran says Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are merciful to one another, but ruthless to the unbelievers. That's chapter 48, verse 29. So if you're going to be ruthless to the unbelievers, you don't care if they're slaves. This is part of the ruthlessness. This is the unbelievers are not equal in dignity before God, before Allah, with the believers. So there was never any abolitionism in Islam. The Muslim countries only abolished slavery under Western pressure, and some quite late. As a matter of fact, slavery only still persists in the world, in North Africa, and under the table in places like Saudi Arabia, where Islamic law is considered to supersede any other code of law, and Islamic law allows for slavery. So Islamic slavery has been completely obscured in all this. It went on far longer and was far more brutal than American slavery, and it is tied to American slavery in that the one wouldn't have existed without the other. It was Muslim slave traders who sold the slaves who went to Europe and America.
And I also think there's evidence that it still exists in places like Mauritania and some of the various parts of Africa. I've also heard, and you certainly can correct me or elaborate, that Islam has sort of, I guess you'd say it's racist, but it's that there's the elite are the Arabs from Saudi Arabia, and then there are concentric circles emanating from there. People who don't speak Arabic, people who are not Arab, are lesser in the constellation of the Islamic structure. Is that true?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, Islamic law, it forbids an Arab man, even if they're both Muslims, an Arab to marry a non-Arab, because Muhammad says Arabs are superior. And there is a tremendous amount of Arab superiority in the Islamic world. I mean, even just consider the names. Muslims generally have Arabic names, even if they're Indonesian or they're Persian or they're Afghan or any number of other nationalities that have nothing to do with the Arabs except that they're all Islamic. Consider American converts to Islam. Cassius Clay becomes Muhammad Ali, and Lou Alcindor becomes Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, because you have to have an Arab name. It's superior to the name that you had before. And this is something that is a manifestation of the Arab supremacism in Islam.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you also have Barack Hussein Obama. But
another non-Arab.
There you go. But there's also, there was a major Holocaust. It can only be described as that, proportions of which are not well known in India, when the Mughals and then other Muslim conquerors tried to subdue that continent and really tried to destroy the Hindu and the other native religions and Buddhism, really by not only just destroying their temples, but massacring hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And perhaps that very same conflict, which still plays out in India today, in that the tense relationship between Muslims and Hindus, but in the fact that they tried to push the borders, like by moving into Arakan province in Burma and massacring Buddhists. Finally, the Burmese have taken, maybe inappropriate, but they've taken action by pushing them out of Arakan, and now they're refugees in Bangladesh. They call them the Rohingya people, but that name really only came into existence in the 1930s, and it was a movement, frankly, similar to the Palestinian movement. You know, they were moving into a region and trying to Islamize it and trying to drive out anyone who didn't support their jihad. And so there's, in that case, a major reaction. Now, of course, the humanitarian issue is another subject, and it's not to be condoned at all. But there's more to that conflict than meets the eye, and it's in a sense a remnant of the old conflict of subjugation of the South Asian continent by Muslim forces.
Yeah, you know, this is the first book, The History of Jihad, to deal with the jihad in India in the context of the whole jihad against the entire non-Muslim world. There have been other books that deal with the jihad against Europe, but this is the first and only book that treats the jihad in India, tells the whole horrible story of how brutal the Muslim conquerors were in India, how many temples they destroyed, how many people they killed or enslaved. It's a horrible story most people in the West do not know about. And yes, it's the reason why there is tension to this day among Hindus and Muslims in India. The Hindus have every reason to be suspicious of the Muslim community in India. Also, there's the modern day fact that Pakistan was 25% Hindu when it was founded, and now it's 3% Hindu because of the ongoing persecution of Hindus by Muslims there.
And obviously the Turks drove out Christians from their ancient homelands in Pontus and in other parts of Anatolia with the Armenian massacre, but also with the pushing out the Greek Christian communities, which predated Islamic Turkey by many, many centuries. Yes. And today you have the phenomena of Muslims creating trouble in Ethiopia, which is one of the world's oldest Christian nations, by already agitating and moving in, and there's already tension starting. So maybe Harvard professor Samuel Huntington was right when he wrote Clash of Civilizations, in that if you look at what he called Islam's bloody borders, you see that where Islamic communities and nations intersect with non-Islamic communities and nations, there's trouble, there's violence, there's conquest, there's aggression. I mean, the Philippines have problems in Mindanao. Thailand has problems on its southern border. They've started to co-opt in Malaysia, which was a multi-religious country. We could look at the fringes of Africa, as I just mentioned, and then obviously in Europe, you've got now not just the migrants, which are there's now up to 1 million in Germany, but you've got the Balkans and you've got the Chechens and other groups that are pushing their way into non-Muslim areas, and doing so mostly in those cases with open violence, open jihad, bloody jihad, but also using the techniques of civilizational jihad, the quiet, the infiltration. In a way, it's like the old communists, right? They'd have a bloody revolution, but they'd also infiltrate and insinuate themselves inside the institutions and march within. and then erode the place to the point where it could be taken over. Is that what's going on?
Oh, absolutely. That's one thing that I think is one of the primary lessons from this book, is that everywhere Muslims have gone, they've created conflict with non-Muslims. It really is not any exception to that historically or today. And so in a certain sense, the history of jihad is an illustration of the correctness of Huntington's thesis, that Islam has bloody borders and bloody innards. There's always conflict. There's always conflict throughout history and all across the world.
Now, recently, you've got some leaders in some nations that are starting to stand up. You've got Eastern Europe in Hungary. You've got Orban and Kurz in Austria, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia. They've all said no. They said no to Islamic immigration. Recently, South Korea said, no, we don't want to have any Islamic immigration. We see what's happened in Europe. Russia certainly has always had a long tradition of knowing how to handle jihad, going way back to the time of the czars. And you've got President Trump. He has listed a couple of nations, including some Islamic nations, as not welcome into the United States because they harbor open jihadists who are enemies of the United States. And he's being pilloried for that by left-wingers who say that he's got something against Muslim men and women. But my question is it too late? Is the West beginning to take appropriate measures to protect their sovereignty and the safety of their citizens and their cultures?
It's not too late. It's never too late. Even if they were to conquer everything, then there would be the resistance. It always goes on. But it certainly is going to be very difficult because in Europe, certainly the regimes have followed suicidal policies of Muslim migration. Now, Sweden, Germany, France, so many countries, the UK, have these massive growing Muslim populations that are increasingly assertive and aggressive and demanding. And they're going to come in conflict inevitably with the non-Muslim populations unless the non-Muslim populations simply surrender and submit altogether, which is a possibility, particularly in Sweden, maybe in France. But the fact is that the jihad imperative continues no matter what. And so any amount of appeasement and accommodation on the part of these Western governments, the governments in Sweden, France, and elsewhere, is never going to result in a blunting of the jihad imperative. There will always still be Muslims who want to carry it through. And so this means that if there's going to be any people at all in those countries who don't want to submit to Sharia and become dhimmis as second class under Islamic law, then there's going to be conflict and possibly even civil war.
And of course, the dhimmi status is a very formal part of the Islamic doctrine. It's in the Quran, it's in the Hadith, and it's a situation where non-Muslims are treated in a way that's similar to the way black people were treated in the United States before the Civil Rights Movement. It's Jim Crow laws, basically. If you're not Muslim, you can't do all these different things. You can't build a church, you can't build a house of worship, you can't marry a Muslim, certainly. Or you in a courtroom, your testimony is not seen as valid if it's against a Muslim. Arcane things like you can't sit on a horse, you can't have your head higher than a Muslim. It's basically a real situation of second-class citizens. And once in a while, if the dhimmis get uppity, they go in and murder a few of them. So just to keep everyone in line. So that's kind of what the dhimmi phenomena is. And I think that for those who say that you're being anti-Muslim or you're being Islamophobic, as they call it, which is a way of saying there's something wrong with you mentally. And I would say it's more jihadophobic anyway.
Yes.
You could point to the fact that today, and certainly over the past centuries, Islam has sovereign nationhood in about 20-25% of the surface of this planet. I mean, they have nations that stretch all the way from Senegal in Africa, all the way to the South Pacific. You've got the Comoros Islands, which are near Madagascar, all the way up to the Central Asia and parts of Europe already, which have Muslim majorities like Bosnia and Albania. So why do they, why not exercise their sovereignty fully, which I support their right to do so, in their own nations? Why is it this need to, inject themselves into the neighboring nations that are not Muslim nations, especially since those same nations, generally speaking, respect the rights of Muslim minorities, like Israel or like Europe? Why do they need to then go in and try to take over those nations? Why not clean up their own house?
Chuck, I see we're running out of time, though, so I'll keep it very brief. But it's expansionist imperative is inherent within Islam. The Quran says to fight against the unbelievers and subjugate them under the rule of Islamic law. Muhammad said, I've been commanded to fight against people, just all people, people, until they confess that there's no God but Allah and I am his messenger. And when they do, their lives and property will be safe from me, which means your lives and property are not safe from him if you don't convert to Islam or submit. So this imperative continues. It's never been rejected or reformed.
All right, Robert Spencer, listen, would you let my listeners know where they can get your excellent book and how they can find out more about Jihad Watch and your other work?
Thanks, Chuck. The History of Jihad is available now for pre-order at Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble.
Hold it up.
And it'll be out very soon in any self-respecting bookstore. And it is, as I say, the only book of its kind. Meanwhile, I'm at jihadwatch.org. That is updated many times daily with news and commentary about jihad activity in the United States and around the world, and the Jihad Watch RS on Twitter and the Jihad Watch group on Facebook.
And if you go to your bookstore and they don't have this book, don't be afraid to ask for it.
Yes.
All right, Robert, thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure.
All right.